The judge's gavel slammed down with a finality that echoed through the hushed courtroom. "The court grants Mrs. Watson's motion in full," he announced, his weathered face showing rare emotion. "Mr. Watson's passport will be confiscated pending resolution of financial matters. All identified accounts are frozen and placed under court supervision." I stood perfectly still, afraid that any movement might wake me from what surely must be a dream. Across the room, Richard, my husband of 25 years, father to our 19-year-old daughter, the man who had abandoned us with nothing but a text message 3 months ago, stared at me with disbelief transforming into rage. His mother, Margaret, immaculate in her designer suit that probably cost more than our monthly rent, pursed her lips until they nearly disappeared. The pristine social image she'd cultivated for decades was crumbling before her country club friends' eyes, and for the first time in our relationship, she had no cutting remark ready. Furthermore, the judge continued, "The court is referring this matter to the district attorney's office to investigate potential criminal charges against both Mr. Watson and Mrs. Margaret Watson for identity fraud and conspiracy." Richard's hastily retained attorney looked stunned. Only yesterday, Richard had flown back to Chicago, certain he could manipulate me as he always had. Only yesterday, he called me from airport security, voice vibrating with barely controlled rage. "What the hell is this, Carol? I came back to work things out. With a one-way ticket and no hotel reservation?" I had countered calmly. Now as our eyes met across the courtroom, I saw the dawning realization in his. His carefully constructed escape had become his prison. I was no longer the desperate woman he had expected to find. For the first time since that devastating text message, I felt something that had been absent from my life for years. Power. The text, 3 months earlier, I was finalizing details for our publishing house 25th anniversary edition when my phone pinged. I glanced at the screen, expecting a routine message from Richard about dinner plans. "Moving to Spain with Samantha. I've transferred our savings to my private account. Good luck paying rent." My hands froze mid-keystroke. My colleague Jen gave me a concerned look, but I somehow managed a reassuring smile. 25 years of marriage ended with less care than canceling a magazine subscription. I excused myself to the bathroom, locked the stall door, and pressed my forehead against the cool metal partition. Who does this? Who ends a 25-year marriage, abandons their family, and steals their entire retirement savings? With a text message? "Thanks for the update," I typed back, three hollow words masking the hurricane of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. I couldn't afford to break down. Not here. Not at work. Samantha was his client's marketing director, 32 to my 52. Our savings represented decades of careful planning and sacrifice, over $200,000 that was supposed to be our retirement fund, our safety net for the second half of our lives. The rent on our Chicago apartment was due in 3 days. My father's voice echoed in my memory. "Always have your own money, Carol girl. Always." But I had trusted Richard. I had believed in our partnership, our shared dreams, our future. That evening at home, I called the bank, hopeful there had been some mistake. The polite representative confirmed my worst fears. Richard had indeed transferred the entire balance from our joint savings to an account under his name only. Since both our names were on the joint account, there was nothing they could do. It wasn't technically theft in the eyes of the banking system. I opened our checking account online, hoping Richard had overlooked our day-to-day funds. The balance read $1,347.12. Our rent was $3,200. That night, our daughter Emily called from college. "Mom? Dad just called me. He says you two are separating. What's going on?" My heart sank. Of course, he'd already reached out to her, shaping the narrative. "It's complicated, sweetheart," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Dad has decided to make some changes in his life. We'll talk more when you're home for spring break next week." "He said you didn't understand him anymore," she said, her voice small. "That he needed to live his truth or something." It sounded rehearsed. A bitter laugh escaped me before I could catch it. I'm sure it did. The mother-in-law. As the reality of our situation sank in, my phone lit up with a call from Richard's mother, Margaret. I almost didn't answer. Margaret had never approved of me, viewing my lack of family pedigree as hopelessly beneath her son's potential. Richard was the golden child of her widowhood, the vessel into which she'd poured all her expectations after her husband's death. Carol, what have you done? She demanded without preamble. Richard says you're refusing to support his career opportunity overseas. I struggled to process her words. What? Richard just told me he's moving to Spain with Samantha. He's cleaned out our accounts. Don't lie to me, she snapped. He showed me the text messages. You're threatening to ruin his reputation at Meridian Global unless he pays you an outrageous settlement. I raised a better son than that, and he won't be bullied. As Margaret continued her tirade, a sickening realization dawned. Richard wasn't just abandoning me. He was actively creating a fictional narrative where I was the villain. And based on the conviction in his mother's voice, she believed every word. Margaret, I interrupted her. Whatever Richard told you is false. I just found out today that he's leaving. He's transferred all our savings, over $200,000, to a private account. You never understood my son, she replied coldly. Always trying to hold him back with your small-town mentality. If he needed that money for his new venture, I'm sure it was justified. Besides, you have your little editing job. My little editing job had supported us during the early years of our marriage while Richard finished his MBA, a degree partially funded by my parents' modest savings. But Margaret had always conveniently forgotten that part of our history. I need to go, I said, knowing any further attempt at explanation would be futile. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about truth, justice, and the remainder of my life. Flashback. The beginning. Richard and I met 30 years ago at a literary conference in New York. I was an ambitious young editor at Horizon Books, while he was completing his MBA and working part-time in marketing for a rival publisher. He pursued me with the charismatic intensity that initially made him successful in his career. Handwritten notes, thoughtful gifts, ambitious date plans that showed he'd researched my interests. You're different from other women I've dated, he told me on our third date, as we walked along the Hudson River. You have substance. My mother might not see it right away, but she'll come around. That should have been my first warning. Within a year, we were married in a small ceremony overlooking Lake Michigan. Margaret attended in a hat worth more than my wedding dress, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. The first years were good ones. We moved to Chicago for my promotion to editor, and Richard easily found a position at a financial consulting firm. We bought a modest condo, traveled occasionally, and planned for our future. When Emily was born 5 years later, we shared parenting duties while balancing our careers. Richard seemed proud of my work ethic, often introducing me as the literary genius of the family. But something shifted when Richard turned 40. His friends were making partner at their firms, buying vacation homes, sending their children to exclusive private schools. Suddenly, our comfortable life seemed insufficient to him. We need to aim higher, he'd say, looking around our condo with a critical eye that hadn't been there before. My classmate Parker just bought a second home in Aspen. What are we doing wrong? My father, a high school English teacher, had always told me that contentment was worth more than wealth. But Richard had been raised differently. Margaret's husband had left her wealthy but emotionally bereft, and she'd taught Richard that status was protection against life's uncertainties. Small expenses began appearing on our credit card without explanation. Richard started working later, citing the need to accelerate our financial growth. His mother became more involved in our lives, often making suggestions about investment opportunities that only seemed to benefit Richard's lifestyle upgrades. Emily should be attending Lakeside Prep, Margaret would say while Richard nodded. She'll never make the right connections at that public school, no matter how good its reputation. Emily, thank goodness, had her father's charm but my practicality. Grandma's living in another century, she'd whisper to me after these visits. Dad seems to forget that too sometimes. 5 years ago, we sold our condo and moved to a rental apartment after Richard convinced me we could use the equity to invest in a client startup. The investment failed within 8 months, but Richard's explanations about market volatility seemed plausible enough. When I suggested returning to full-time work after years of part-time editing, Richard insisted it wasn't necessary. Trust me, he would say. I've got everything under control. I did trust him, though doubts occasionally surfaced. Like when I discovered receipts for dinners on nights he claimed to be working late, or when he became defensive about his phone, keeping it face down and taking calls in another room. Each time, his explanations seemed just reasonable enough to quiet my suspicions. The office visit. The day after Richard's devastating text, I headed to his office, determined to confront him in person. Surely, he wouldn't simply vanish without properly dissolving our marriage. The Richard I married wasn't cruel. Image conscious and occasionally selfish, but not heartless. The receptionist's expression shifted from professional welcome to discomfort when I asked for Richard. I'm sorry, Mrs. Watson, but Richard no longer works here. He resigned last week. Last week. My voice sounded distant, even to my own ears. That's impossible. He was here Monday. She fidgeted with a pen. I'm really not supposed to discuss personnel matters, but he submitted his resignation 2 weeks ago. Yesterday was his last day. 2 weeks. While I was planning our anniversary dinner and helping Emily with her summer internship applications, Richard had been orchestrating his escape. The receptionist avoided eye contact as I thanked her and walked numbly toward the elevator. In the parking garage, I called Richard's closest friend, Michael. Hey, Carol, he answered cautiously. How are you holding up? You knew, I said, realization dawning. You knew he was planning to leave. Michael's hesitation confirmed it before he spoke. He made me promise not to say anything. Said he needed a clean break. A clean break from his family? From 25 years of marriage? My voice rose despite my efforts to remain calm. Look, I know you've been friends since college, but how could you keep this from me? I'm sorry, he said quietly. I told him it was wrong, but Samantha makes him feel young again. He said you'd be better off without him dragging you down. Samantha makes him feel young again. The words cut deeper than they should have. Richard's gradual withdrawal over the past year suddenly made sense. The new clothes, gym membership, the mysterious weekend conferences. Did he tell you he emptied our bank accounts? I asked. Michael's silence spoke volumes. Christ, Carol, I had no idea he'd go that far. His voice dropped. That's messed up. After ending the call, I sat in my car, the full scope of Richard's betrayal washing over me. This wasn't an impulsive decision or momentary weakness. It was a calculated escape, meticulously planned while he played the role of committed husband. I thought of all the signs I'd ignored. 3 months ago, Richard had announced he'd been offered a consulting opportunity that would require occasional international travel. The increased income will help rebuild our retirement funds, he'd explained after the failed startup investment had depleted them. Around the same time, he'd mentioned Samantha, a marketing director at one of his client companies who was amazingly efficient at connecting him with new business opportunities. Last week, I'd found a Barcelona travel guide hidden in his desk drawer. When I asked about it, he'd laughed it off. The team might open a European office someday. Just doing some preliminary research. I'd accepted his explanation, ignoring the slight tremor in his voice and the way his eyes didn't quite meet mine. That travel guide should have been my wake-up call. Instead, it became just another warning sign I chose not to see clearly until it was too late. The lawyer, 3 days after Richard's departure, I sat across from Yoko Tanaka, a divorce attorney recommended by a colleague. Her office was modest but orderly, with certificates and thank you notes framing the walls. At 55, she projected the calm confidence I desperately needed. Let me be clear, she said after reviewing my documents. What your husband did is reprehensible, but not entirely illegal. Since you were married, he had legal access to those joint accounts, even if he was planning to abandon you. My voice cracked despite my efforts to remain composed. So he just gets away with it? 25 years together, and he can take everything? Not at all, Yoko smiled slightly. The good news is judges don't look kindly on this kind of behavior, especially in long-term marriages. We can petition for emergency financial support and potentially freeze any remaining assets. She leaned forward. What we need is proof that he's continuing to earn income while evading his marital responsibilities. I nodded, already gathering evidence. Screenshots of Richard's text messages, bank statements showing the massive withdrawal, emails about the Barcelona position. Carol, Yoko said gently. I've been specializing in gray divorce for 15 years, and I've seen this pattern before. Men who leave long marriages for younger women often follow predictable behavior. They hide assets, create false narratives about being misunderstood, and attempt to rewrite the history of the marriage. That's exactly what he's doing, I said, relieved someone understood. His mother believes I'm somehow preventing him from pursuing his career. The mother-in-law, Yoko nodded knowingly, often a key player in these situations. We'll need to investigate her involvement too. That evening, I called my daughter at college. Mom, I'm coming home, Emily said immediately. My psych professor will understand. No, honey, stay at school. Focus on your finals, I insisted. I'm okay. You're not okay. And that's fine, she countered with typical directness. That's being a total glitch, and you shouldn't have to deal with this alone. Besides, he's been calling me nonstop with his side of the story. I'd rather be with you. Tears welled in my eyes. At 19, my daughter was showing more maturity than her 55-year-old father. When did you get so grown up? When I wasn't looking, apparently, she said, her attempt at humor not quite masking her pain. I'll be home tomorrow night. With Emily safely on her way, I turned my attention to Richard's abandoned home office. I needed any documentation that might help my case, tax returns, employment contracts, anything that proved his income potential and ongoing obligations. In the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath a stack of old warranties, I found a sealed envelope addressed to Margaret. Curiosity overrode my hesitation. Inside was a birthday card and a handwritten note. Mom, thanks for helping with the Barcelona apartment deposit. Samantha and I can't wait to show you our new place when you visit in May. We couldn't have made this happen without your support. Love, Richard. The date on the card was from 3 months ago, around the time Richard had first mentioned his international consulting work. Margaret hadn't just known about his plans. She had financially supported them. With shaking hands, I photographed the card and note, then continued searching. Tax returns, investment statements, our marriage certificate. I organized everything methodically. In his email drafts folder on our shared computer, I discovered an unsent message to Samantha with an attached resume listing his new position at Meridian Global Barcelona with a start date just 2 days after his text to me. The evidence showed this wasn't a sudden midlife crisis. It was a calculated exit strategy months in the making, supported by his mother and hidden from his family. For the first time since receiving Richard's message, I allowed myself to cry, not from heartbreak, but from the overwhelming realization of the deliberate deception I'd been living with. When the tears subsided, one thought remained clear. Richard had underestimated me. He had always underestimated me. Mother and daughter, Emily arrived home the next evening, dropping her backpack in the hallway and wrapping me in a fierce hug before I could even greet her properly. Despite everything, I felt a surge of maternal pride. My daughter stood nearly as tall as me now, her dark hair cut in a practical bob that framed a face both familiar and startlingly adult. I ordered Thai food, she announced, producing a bag of takeout. And I brought reinforcements. She pulled a bottle of wine from her backpack. We're having a strategy session. I see your fake ID is still working, I observed dryly. Mom, focus on the bigger crime here, she counted, heading to the kitchen for plates. Dad stealing your retirement trumps a little underage wine purchase. We settled at the dining table, and Emily listened intently as I detailed what I discovered. Her psychology major mind worked visibly behind her eyes, processing and analyzing. Classic narcissistic behavior, she finally said. Dad's rewriting the narrative to make himself the hero of his own story. And Grandma's enabling it because it validates her worldview about you never being good enough for her precious son. When did you get so insightful about your father? I asked. Emily twirled noodles around her fork thoughtfully. Remember when I was 16 and wanted to apply for that summer journalism program instead of the business internship Grandma arranged? Dad gave me this whole speech about disappointing the family legacy and wasting opportunities. I remembered. Richard had been unusually harsh, and I'd attributed it to work stress. You stood up for me, Emily continued. You said I needed to follow my own path, not someone else's blueprint. Dad didn't speak to either of us for days afterward. She set down her fork. That's when I started seeing the pattern. How he'd undermine your decisions about me, then act like the reasonable one stepping in. How Grandma would reinforce it. I didn't realize you noticed all that, I said quietly. Mom, I'm studying psychology. She smiled sadly. Family dynamics are basically my homework. She reached for my hand. You know the worst part? He really believes he deserves this. The younger woman, the fresh start, the money. In his mind, he's earned it after years of putting up with us. Her insight stunned me. I'd been so focused on the practical impacts of Richard's betrayal that I hadn't fully processed the psychological manipulation at play. So what do we do now? Emily asked. We fight, I said simply. With Yoko's help, we document everything, follow the money, and make sure the court sees exactly what happened here. Emily nodded. And I have access to his cloud account, she added casually. He used my birthday as part of his password. Typical. I found something you should see. She opened her laptop and navigated to a folder labeled innocuously as MG Project 2023. Inside were documents that made my blood run cold. A detailed timeline for Richard's departure, emails with Margaret about financial arrangements, and most disturbingly, a document titled Strategy, outlining plans to use my brief therapy sessions after my mother's death as evidence of emotional instability if I contested the divorce settlement. He was going to use Grandma's death against you, Emily said, her voice tight with anger. The fact that you saw a therapist for 3 months to process your grief. I remembered those difficult sessions, how Richard had seemed supportive, encouraging me to take all the time you need to heal. Now I understood his encouragement had been strategic, documentation for future leverage. We need to send these to Yoko immediately, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. As Emily forwarded the documents, I felt something unexpected, not just anger or betrayal, but a profound sense of clarity. The man I had dedicated 25 years to had never truly seen me. Not as a partner, not as an equal, not even as a complete person. I had been a supporting character in the Richard Watson story, useful until I wasn't. Mom, Emily said quietly, watching my face. Are you okay? No, I answered honestly. But I will be. We both will be. The final showdown. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal motions, evidence gathering, and emotional recalibration. Yoko filed for emergency financial orders based on the evidence we discovered. Richard's lawyer responded with a dismissive offer of $5,000 as full settlement of all claims. They're testing your desperation, Yoko advised. Don't engage. That night, I received a direct message from Richard. Take the settlement, Carol. You won't get more, and fighting will just drain what little I've offered. Be reasonable for once. His condescension ignited a quiet fury. I didn't respond, but saved the message as further evidence of his attitude. 2 days later, we secured an emergency hearing date. That same afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Samantha's former colleague, Jennifer, who had discovered my contact information. I thought you should know what they were planning, Jennifer said hesitantly. Samantha's been talking about this for months, how they were going to start fresh in Spain without any baggage. She even bragged about how Richard was setting aside money where you couldn't touch it. My momentary optimism crumbled as Jennifer described conversations she'd overheard about offshore accounts and establishing residency in Spain specifically to complicate legal proceedings. They have a whole plan to make fighting them so expensive and difficult that you'll eventually give up, Jennifer concluded. I'm sorry. I just thought you deserved to know what you're up against. The morning of our emergency hearing, I woke to another text from Richard. I hear you're dragging Mom into this. Bad move, Carol. Drop this now, or I'll make sure you regret it. His threat strengthened my resolve. In the courthouse, Yoko and I waited outside the assigned courtroom, reviewing our presentation one final time. The doors opened, and Richard's lawyer emerged, a polished man in an expensive suit who exuded confidence. Mrs. Watson, he nodded curtly. Mr. Hoffman, representing Richard Watson. Before I could respond, an unexpected figure appeared behind him. Margaret, immaculately dressed and wearing the same disapproving expression she directed at me for years. You should be ashamed, she hissed, ignoring Yoko's warning hand on my arm. Trying to extort my son when you're the one who drove him away. Mrs. Watson, Yoko interjected smoothly. Since you're here, I should inform you that we'll be calling you as a witness regarding your financial support of your son's abandonment of his family. Margaret's face paled slightly, but she maintained her composure. I have no idea what you're talking about. The hearing proceeded with clinical efficiency. The judge listened to both arguments, reviewed our evidence of Richard's withdrawal of funds and new employment, and granted our emergency motions. Richard would be required to provide immediate financial support and return a portion of the marital assets while the case proceeded. It felt like a significant victory, but Margaret's unexpected appearance troubled me. Why had she flown to Chicago for a routine emergency hearing? That question was answered the next day when I received a call from an unknown international number. Is this Carol Watson? A woman's accented voice inquired. Yes. Who's calling? My name is Lucia Vega, HR Director at Meridian Global Barcelona. I'm calling about your husband, Richard Watson. My heart raced. Yes, we received your email about his employment situation. I wanted to inform you that Mr. Watson no longer works for Meridian Global. He was terminated yesterday. I frowned in confusion. I didn't send any email. There was a pause. Someone using your name sent documentation showing Mr. Watson was involved in a financial dispute and had pending legal issues in the United States. Company policy requires disclosure of such matters during the hiring process. The realization hit me. Margaret. She had impersonated me to sabotage Richard's employment, ensuring he couldn't comply with the court's support order. It was a calculated move to undermine the judge's ruling and validate Richard's claim that he couldn't afford to support me. Ms. Vega, I did not send that email. Could you forward it to me? Minutes later, I was staring at a message allegedly from me, filled with distorted half-truths about Richard's situation and threatening the company with legal action if they continued employing him. The email included copies of our personal documents, some of which I'd only recently gathered for Yoko. My apartment had been untouched, which meant only one person could have accessed those documents. Margaret, during her brief visit to the building lobby the day before the hearing, when she claimed to be dropping off family photos for Emily. I immediately called Yoko, who validated my suspicions. This is identity fraud and interference with a court order. We need to document everything and file additional motions. While we were developing this new strategy, my phone rang again. Richard, calling directly for the first time since his departure. You vindictive bitch, he snarled without preamble. You got me fired after everything I offered you. It wasn't me, Richard. It was your mother. His momentary silence confirmed he recognized the possibility. That's absurd. Why would she do that? To make you look unable to pay support, to undermine the court order, to turn you further against me. You're lying, he said. But uncertainty had crept into his voice. Mom would never sabotage my career. Look at the email that was sent. I'm forwarding it to you now. Those documents were in our apartment until your mother visited. The line went silent for several seconds. I'll call you back, he finally said. 20 minutes later, my phone pinged with an email from Richard containing a bombshell. A series of text messages between him and Margaret revealing a disturbing truth. This wasn't just about Richard leaving. It was about Margaret's lifelong campaign to control her son and eliminate perceived threats to that control. Once you're established in Spain, Margaret had written 3 months earlier, we can discuss your future without Carol's constant undermining. Her little breakdown after her mother died shows how unstable she really is. My grief after losing my mother, which I'd worked through with therapy and what I thought was Richard's support, had been weaponized against me all along. The revelation of Margaret and Richard's long-term dynamic transformed my understanding of our marriage. This wasn't merely about a midlife crisis or a younger woman. It was about a lifelong pattern of emotional manipulation that I'd been drawn into 25 years ago. Yoko immediately filed additional motions documenting Margaret's identity fraud and interference with court orders. We also reported the identity theft to the police, creating an official record of Margaret's illegal actions. We've strengthened our position considerably, Yoko assured me. But Richard still has the advantage of physical distance and most of your marital assets. I knew we needed something more, undeniable evidence that would convince a judge to freeze all of Richard's assets and potentially compel his return to the United States. The text messages proved the conspiracy, but not the location of our missing savings. In a moment of inspiration, I contacted Michael again. I need your help, I said without preamble. Not for me, but for the truth. Michael's guilt over his silent complicity in Richard's plans made him receptive. What do you need? Information. Richard must have told you more about his financial arrangements, where he was moving the money, how he planned to support himself in Spain. There was a long pause. He mentioned an account in the Cayman Islands. Said his mom helped him set it up years ago for tax purposes. I didn't think much of it at the time. Did he mention the bank name? Any details at all? First Caribbean International, I think. Look, Carol, I'm sorry I didn't say anything sooner. I never thought he'd go this far. This new information gave us a starting point, but we needed details. Account numbers, transfer records, anything that would concretely tie Richard to hidden assets. Emily's access to Richard's cloud storage proved invaluable again. Working together, we found a folder of financial documents that Richard had failed to properly secure. Screenshots of transfer confirmations, correspondence with Margaret about the offshore account, even a document titled Asset Protection Strategy. I immediately forwarded everything to Yoko, who called back within the hour, her voice tense with controlled excitement. This is exactly what we needed. I'm filing for emergency orders freezing the Cayman account and requesting international enforcement. 2 days later, we received our first major victory. The judge granted our motion to freeze Richard's offshore account pending further investigation. Richard's lawyer immediately filed a counter motion accusing me of illegal access to electronic information, which momentarily threatened our progress. Then came an unexpected complication. Samantha called me directly. Carol, we need to talk, she said, her voice lacking its usual confidence. Richard's falling apart here. That's not my concern anymore. Please, she insisted. He's talking about flying back to Chicago to fix things with you directly. I'm worried about what he might do. A chill ran through me. Richard had never been physically violent, but his current desperation made him unpredictable. Why are you telling me this, Samantha? Because this isn't what I signed up for. He promised a fresh start, not a man obsessing over his ex-wife and hiding money from me too. Her words caught me off guard. He has another account I just found out about. After the judge froze the Cayman account, he told me we'd be fine because he has backup funds even his mother doesn't know about. This was potentially crucial information, but I sensed Samantha wasn't sharing out of pure altruism. What do you want, Samantha? Protection, she said simply. When Richard finds out I've talked to you, he'll turn on me too. I need assurance that I won't face legal consequences for my role in this. After consulting with Yoko, we crafted a proposal, immunity for Samantha in exchange for complete documentation of all accounts and a sworn statement about Richard and Margaret's conspiracy. Samantha agreed immediately, sending bank statements showing a second account in Liechtenstein containing the bulk of our marital assets, over $180,000. With this final piece of evidence, we secured an emergency restraining order just hours before Richard's scheduled arrival in Chicago. When his plane landed, airport security would be waiting. Epilogue. 6 months later, 6 months after that fateful courtroom victory, Emily and I sat on the small balcony of my new condo, watching the spring sunset paint Chicago's skyline. The court-ordered forensic accounting had uncovered not just our marital assets, but additional funds Margaret had hidden for tax purposes. Both faced civil penalties, with Margaret also charged with identity fraud for impersonating me to Meridian Global. Richard's attempts to rebuild his life in Chicago after the court confiscated his passport had floundered. His industry colleagues had gradually distanced themselves as the public court records detailed his financial dishonesty and abandonment. Samantha had returned to her marketing career, her immunity agreement having served its purpose for both of us. The divorce finalized with terms that acknowledged my 25 years of partnership, complete restoration of our marital assets plus legal fees and substantial financial support indexed to Richard's future earnings. Most satisfying was watching Margaret's carefully constructed social facade crumble when her country club friends discovered she had committed identity fraud to sabotage her own son's employment. The woman who had judged me for years now faced judgment from her peers. Mom, did you ever think we'd end up here? Emily asked, sipping her tea as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the skyline. She was home for spring break, her sophomore year of college nearly complete. Here specifically? No, I admitted, but somewhere better than where we were. I always believed that was possible. Emily smiled. You know what's weird? I'm almost grateful this happened. Not the way it happened, she clarified quickly, but that it did. You're different now. Different how? I asked. Stronger. More yourself. She gestured toward my laptop, where the manuscript of my first novel sat open. You're doing things you always talked about but never had time for. You're not apologizing for taking up space anymore. Her observation struck me with its accuracy. Somewhere in the process of fighting for what was rightfully mine, I'd rediscovered parts of myself that had been gradually compromised during my marriage. My new position as senior editor at the publishing house came with the confidence I'd earned through years of experience, no longer diminished by Richard's subtle undermining. What about you? I asked my daughter. How are you really doing with all of this? Emily considered the question seriously, a trait I'd always admired in her. I'm sad about who Dad turned out to be, but I'm not sad about our life now. She reached for my hand. My psych professor says that sometimes we need to lose the story we thought we were living to find the one we're meant to write. I smiled at her wisdom. When did you get so smart? Must be genetic. She grinned, then grew serious again. Dad called last week. He wants to meet for coffee when I'm back in the fall. How do you feel about that? I haven't decided yet, she said honestly. Part of me wants to understand why he did what he did. Another part thinks there's no explanation that would ever make sense. I nodded, understanding her ambivalence perfectly. Whatever you decide, I support you. We sat in comfortable silence as the city lights began to twinkle around us. In the distance, Lake Michigan stretched dark and vast, the same lake where Richard and I had exchanged vows 25 years ago. I felt a momentary pang, not of regret but of acknowledgement of the years invested, the memories created, the lessons learned. You know, when I got that text from your father, I said quietly, he ended it with good luck paying rent. Like that was the worst thing he could imagine happening to me, being without his financial support. Emily snorted. Classic Dad. But here's the thing, I continued. He never understood that I wasn't afraid of starting over. I was afraid of living inauthentically. And now I don't have to. My phone pinged with a message from my publisher. The editing team loved my manuscript and wanted to fast-track it for next spring's catalog. Another small victory in a series of personal reclamations. At 52, I was rediscovering what it meant to live on my own terms, without apology or permission. Richard's parting text, good luck paying rent, had been intended as a devastating final blow. Instead, it became the first line of a story about finding strength I never knew I possessed.